أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم من همزه ونفخه ونفثه بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على رسولنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه ومن والاه. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. We are gonna start with these check-ins inshallah, and so the questions are: how are you? How is your day? How is your week? Both. Today is the last day of the Gregorian calendar. How do you feel about that? Now, you don't need to feel anything specific, but if you have any thoughts on this, then we can go over that. Obviously, this is different than the Julian calendar, which was originally how it was before, like many, like a long time ago, right? I believe Julius Caesar was the one who instituted that, but it had some differences in terms of the number of days. I think in 2000 it was about 13 days off from the Gregorian calendar, but anyways, they both matched in terms of the leap year for that year. But anyways, we are using the Gregorian calendar. If you have any thoughts on that, if you have any reflections on that, if not, if you go by the Islamic calendar, then today and tomorrow are going to have no meaning to you, right? So I do want to kind of focus on a topic over here. So that's today's topic, but I want you to think about how what I just described and how what we end up using as our norms impact the way that we perceive the world, the way we see things and stuff, that way we understand concepts and things like that. So just keep that in mind, that is sort of what we're going to be talking about today, inshallah. How do you feel about that? And also, why? Why do you feel that way? So not only how do you feel, but why do you feel that way? Go ahead. This is a thought experiment that I want you to think about, communication related. How do our languages impact the way we perceive things? Meaning, other people's opinions about things, people's perspectives about general things and stuff, right? Other people's opinions about ourselves, right? Our self-image, pretty much anything in life. How do we use language, and how does language shape the way that we perceive things, we understand things, how we learn things, how we grow and develop, how we communicate and interact with people, and so on. And when I say language, I'm not talking about a static, fixed one language. I'm talking about the different languages that we come across. People sometimes are able to speak multiple languages, right? These people might have a different understanding, a slightly different understanding, or maybe more enhanced understanding of how to answer this particular question, for example. But maybe other people have the same general idea about how different things can be shaped by different understandings and weight that we attach to particular concepts or words or so on. For example, all I'm doing right now is breathing, and my breathing through my vocal cords is creating certain sounds that I am controlling, in the sense that I know what I'm supposed to try to do, right? And that is then having that is going through your ears, and when it goes through the ears, interpreted in a certain way, and your brain has meaning that has been sorry. So for example, the word W-O-R-D, right, has a particular meaning to you, even though all it is technically just sound, and sound is just vibration in the air, for example, right? So if that's the case, then we're attributing, or we're connecting specific meaning to specific vibrations in the air, and that's it. That's all it is. But then we also attach meaning to it, right? What is the meaning that we attach to it? We designate certain things to it. For example, word. There are a bunch of words over here. Now you have this in mind, what words mean, and so that's why you know what I'm talking about when I say word. But before you knew what a word was, when you were like, let's say 1 year old, how would you have pointed at this and said this is a word? How is it that they can train primates, others, for example, like whatever, just like, or like how do they work with other animals? I believe crows and others can also communicate with us in a certain way, and they're very intellectual. So how do we train them in terms of being able to recognize commands? For example, when you train a dog to hear the sound vibration, or the air vibration, right? And it's saying sit, and it has interpreted it as sitting down. It has a meaning attached to it. So these are the kinds of things that I want you to think about. Now again, we start this off to prime your brain to start looking for these answers and so on. And then we go to the, this stuff, we just do a quick review before we watch the videos, and then we come back and answer that thought experiment. Okay, so this is a review about how transformation works. I remember I asked you, how do we change people's perspectives? How do we help impact the society by bringing in values that we believe are, I guess for lack of a better word, better for the entire society, and that's specifically referring to the STEM over here. How do we transform ourselves as well? Just kind of think about the process of going from the end vision, which has to be realistic, which we said was step 0, going through that, figuring out where we stand currently, kind of figuring out the path between where we are, point A and point B, and then kind of mapping it out into daily chunks as well. And we're still in, step 3, but step 4 is something where you can break it down into daily action plans and so on. That includes discussions about motivation and so on. How do we have sustainable transformation? Just some things to keep in mind. These are just reviews, so I'm not really going into details. This is sort of a summary of a lot of the stuff we talked about before. Some possible case studies that we can look at, and this is pretty much, after the thought experiment, if we have time and anybody wants to go into certain things. But these are not the only possible, case studies. We can look at multiple different things. If you have any questions about certain things, if you're trying to figure out how to develop habits, or if you want to, do something, whatever, if you want to plan out your life, for example, whatever it might be, there is a section at the end that I have open in case anybody wants to go through them, go through that, and we can go into mapping out from step 0 until step 3 at least, how to get to whatever it is that you want to in terms of goal setting and so on. I'm going to quickly switch over to that really quick so you can see that I have it ready. So again, anytime you guys want to get into this, we've done several case studies before, but we spent a lot more time kind of going through brain games recently, but we can always go back to them. So again, this is referring to kind of helping you with that. So moving forward, these case studies are possible, but we've done other ones, and we can do other ones that you would like to do. Now let's continue with these brain games that we do. These are the main thing here. So pick one, and we'll go from there. All right. Now this one. Leave.
Recently adopted. Baby Kanzi was recently adopted and adjusting to life in his new home. His mother was working with a language coach to learn some English, and Kanzi usually came along, though he didn't appear to pay much attention. But the language coach noticed that he seemed to be picking up on how to communicate just by watching his mother's lessons. Oddly enough, it appeared that he was picking things up faster than his mom. For example, the phrases "you tickle" and "tickle you" meant two different things, and Kanzi's mom, she was having a hard time understanding that syntax. One day, Kanzi was hanging out playing with stuffed animals, and the coach asked him to make the dog bite the snake. Kanzi put the snake into the dog's mouth like it was no big deal. It was a really big deal because Kanzi is a bonobo. He's actually a language superstar, even among the elite research primates like Coco the gorilla. Kanzi is the first ape to demonstrate that language can be acquired spontaneously through observation without planned training, and the first to show a rudimentary understanding of grammar, syntax, and semantics.
Now this is important because these words that he's using over here talk about how we understand construction of language, but also, in a way, construction of our perspectives and construction of reality in general overall.
Again, really big deal, especially because for years humans have been proclaiming that it's language that sets us apart from other animals. But are we really alone? Turns out that question keeps getting more and more complicated. Technically, we define language as a set of spoken, written, or signed words and the way we combine them to communicate meaning.
Now this is how we designate this word, the language, a particular definition. We are the ones that define this. And obviously, whatever we define, we go with that framing.
If we change that definition to include the use of complex grammar, then maybe we are alone. But if language is simply the ability to communicate through a meaningful sequence of symbols, as I might do while looking for a bathroom in Sweden, or Kanzi does when she's asking for roast marshmallows, well then, welcome to the club, apes. We communicate in part by engaging our brains and bodies to make sounds that let us transfer thoughts from our brain to other people's brains. But
how is that different from communicating between cell phones or between your router and your computer or just anything in general?
Of course, language is more than just making air vibrate with sound. I can communicate by moving my hands, which you might have noticed I do pretty frequently, or by using visual symbols. All of these forms of language allow us to comprehend things we've never actually witnessed and exchange information with each other quickly and effectively to, get a job or be a friend or use a metaphor. It's hard to imagine a fulfilling life without some kind of language. Humans have nearly 7,000 different languages, and no matter how different they sound, we can break down their basic structure in the same way, using the same 3 building blocks. The smallest of them are phonemes. These are very short, distinctive sound units like ah, t, ch, sh, like stuff like that. English uses about 40 of them. Phonemes go together to make morphemes, which are the smallest units that carry meaning. This can be words or parts of words like a prefix or a suffix. For example, the word speech is a morpheme that contains 4 phoneme sound units, s, p, e, and ch. From there, you arrange morphemes into your language's grammar or system of rules, allowing you to say the things that you want to say. So those 40 English phonemes give us over 100,000 morphemes that produce the more than 616,000 words in the Oxford English Dictionary, which can be arranged into an infinite number of sentences, paragraphs, Wu-Tang lyrics, or Shakespearean plays. And just as the structure of language starts small, so does how we learn language. And we start very young. The word infant comes from the Latin infans, meaning not speaking. But as early as 4 months, they can recognize differences in speech and start to read lips matching mouth movements with their corresponding sounds like ah, e, I, oh. And even at this age, you gotta watch what you say about kids in their presence, because this also marks the beginning of receptive language, or the ability to understand what's being said both to and about us.
I notice over here the concept of context. How does context impact the way we think, the way we communicate, the way we understand and learn things?
Soon that receptive language blooms to accommodate productive language, when instead of just understanding other people, babies start developing the ability to produce words. Of course, that takes a while, but in the meantime, they get a lot of practice babbling. Beginning at about 4 months, they start to make all sorts of sounds. Although you may get a dada or a mama, babbling is not an imitation of adult speech. In fact, it typically includes sounds from many different languages, and a stranger couldn't tell if a kid was Italian or Kenyan or Korean just by the sound of her babbling. Similarly, deaf babies will watch their parents signing and start babbling with their hands. By about 10 months, that babbling morphs into something that starts to make sense, and mama probably really means mama. Now, without exposure to other languages, a child will actually lose the ability to both hear and create particular tones and sounds that aren't part of his or her household language. So someone who speaks English around the house soon won't be able to differentiate between certain phonemes in Mandarin if they heard them, for instance, or between aspirated and non-aspirated consonants in Hindi. By the time they're mowing down the first birthday cake, most kids will be entering the one-word stage of language development. They now know that sounds carry specific meanings and connect the sound dog to that furry thing across the room. By around 18 months, their capacity for learning new words jumps from about 1 a week to 1 a day.
Okay, also think about how your brain is functioning in this stage, but also throughout, in terms of why a person might not pick up certain sounds, or why people sort of start thinking in a certain language. So what language do you think in, for example? Do you think in Arabic or English or Urdu or Bengali or whatever? What language do you think in? And can that change? And what is happening in the brain to accommodate you in a particular context?
By the time they're 2, they're probably speaking in 2-word statements. These choppy sentences are kind of like telegraphic speech. They sound like clumsy texts or old-school telegrams, using mostly nouns and verbs. What juice, no pants, that kind of stuff. These little sentences make sense and they follow the rules of their language's syntax. For example, an English-speaking child would put an adjective before a noun, black cat, while a Spanish speaker would reverse that, gato negro. From there, the average kid is soon uttering longer phrases and complete sentences, refusing to put pants on and demanding more crackers. Most humans hit these same milestones during their language development, but there are competing theories about how our infant babbles turn into complex sentences and how we acquire language. You remember B.F. Skinner, the pioneering behaviorist who brought us learning through reinforcement. He believed language was a product of associative principles and operant conditioning. Skinner argued that a kid learned to associate words with meanings largely through reinforcement. So in the Skinner model, for example, if baby Bruno says, and his mother gives him some milk, he'll find that the outcome, both the milk and the attention, rewarding, and eventually work his way up to saying milk through these learned associations and shaping processes. It's good to be understood, right? But as usual, not everyone was on board with Skinner. In particularly, legendary American linguist Noam Chomsky argued that a kid like Bruno would never reach his full complex sonnet writing potential if his learning was dependent on conditioning alone. Chomsky instead proposed the idea of innate learning and ubiquitous grammatical categories, pointing out that while the world's thousands of languages may sound wildly diverse, they're actually very similar, sharing some basic elements. He called this universal grammar. Chomsky's universal grammar posited that all human languages contain nouns, verbs, and adjectives, and humans are born with an innate ability to acquire language and even a genetic predisposition to learn grammatical rules. Rather than being linguistic blank slates, Chomsky suggested that we're hardwired for it from day one. In the end, though, we're still not sure how we acquire language. However, developmental research and studies of other species have given us a sense that at least some of it is innate, while the role of learning and exposure is also important. So if it's true that all humans have some innate capacity for language, where in the brain is it sitting? We've talked a lot about how function is localized in the brain, and that is definitely true for some aspects of language, but while speaking, reading, writing, and even singing all fall under the language umbrella, their locations in the brain are a little more complicated. Consider aphasia, a neurological impairment of language. People can experience lots of different kinds of aphasia depending on whether they've suffered an injury or stroke or a tumor or dementia. So maybe they can speak but not read. Maybe they can sing but barely speak, or write but not read. The region of the brain known as Broca's area in the left frontal lobe is involved with the production of speech. If I suffered a trauma to this area, I might still comprehend speech but struggle to speak, although I might still be able to sing because that's conducted elsewhere in the brain. On the other hand, if that falling coconut struck another region called the Wernicke's area, a region in the left temporal lobe involved in the expression and comprehension of language, I'd still be able to speak, but my language wouldn't make any sense. So you might find me saying something like, "It was two pizza I called Purple Brother on the television." Aphasia and other brain injuries remind us how thinking and language are both separate and intricately entwined. For instance, it's hard to say if nonverbal ideas come to us first and we think of the words to name them, or if instead our thoughts are born in language, or if we'd be able to even think without it. And because language often helps to frame your ideas, your thinking might actually be influenced by which language you're using. So what are the implications of this if we expand the definition of language to include other species? How might Kanzi's ability to communicate that he wants a marshmallow affect his thinking? And how might that thinking influence his language progression and his identity? If only I had the words to describe how fascinating this all is. If you understood the language I was using today, you learned how languages are built from phonemes, morphemes, and grammar, and when children acquire receptive and productive language and pass through the babbling one-word and two-word phases of development. You also learned some theories on how we acquire language, what brain areas are involved, and how thinking and language are connected. Thanks for watching, especially to all of our Subbable subscribers. If you'd like to sponsor an episode of Crash Course or even be animated into an upcoming episode, just go to subbable.com/Crash Course. This episode was written by Kathleen Yale, edited by Blake T. Pastino, and our consultant is Dr. Rob.
Alright. This question now. Any thoughts on this? And you can comment on the last video as well. maybe you can also think about how people from different communities might actually have good intent when they're trying to work with whoever they're working with, but the other person might, because of their context, interpret it in a negative way. And how can we then make sure that these conflicts don't continue and progress and escalate? Could also happen within families. For example, if parents are from a certain context or a certain background or culture where certain values and certain concepts and ideas were framed a certain way, and then they end up living, or their children end up being in it from they're being raised in a particular different community or context with different languages and understandings and framings, where that conflict could arise. So how do we address that, or how can we make sure that we can at least expose people to this concept, today's discussion, so that they can potentially avoid these kinds of conflicts, and we can have some more harmony than we might have otherwise. Just certain other things to think about as you're thinking about this this thought experiment.
I think earlier, like I guess before you showed us the second video, you were mentioning thinking about how all these ideas, to what extent and how much do they vary because of being in the technological world? And I always think about like how text messages, they read a certain way, but you don't get a lot of things that come with normal communication, like actual verbal speech. Like you don't get tone, you don't get body language, you don't get facial expressions. Um, and sometimes you get something very well crafted, not necessarily in a good way or bad way, but like not authentic. You don't get the ums and ahs in text messages in the same way that you do in real life, and it kind of shifts how we hear someone else or perceive somebody else, and that can kind of shift our perspective about a person because of how they communicate with us digitally as well. And in regards to like the second part of this question, like how do we account for like people's perceptions and such in communication with ourselves and others? I think learning to distinguish when it's more appropriate to use a different method of communication, or having cues for yourself to recognize when it's better to use a different method of communication is good. For example, having a very serious text message might not be the best way to communicate like a really big thing, or some kind of announcement or something that's like actually a big deal or impacts your family or something like that. I guess the most notorious thing is like people always say, and obviously this doesn't really apply to us as Muslims, but people shouldn't break up with people over text. Like people always say that, um, and it's viewed negatively in our society when people do that. Um, so yeah, so things that like impact people in a really heavy way or might have really heavy consequences, it's best to try to communicate with them verbally, where you're able to have tone. When you think you're having a tough conversation, where you need someone to see your tone, your facial expressions, your body language, and you just being a person in front of them. Sometimes it's important to figure out what conversations are okay to have and not okay to have, um, over text, for example.
Okay, so this puts a lot of stuff to consider on the table, and sometimes people may not consider all these things and consequently end up in particular negative adverse situations. I do have a question. So you were mentioning about messages, or text messages, for example. What's your favorite book?
My favorite book?
Yeah, favorite book or favorite author?
Wow, is this when we tell you that we don't read as much as we should?
No, no, no. It's meant to do something else. Anything. It could be anything. It doesn't matter.
The first book that came to mind was a book that I liked a lot as a kid. I really liked this book called The Tale of Despero by Kate DiCamillo. It's about this mouse, and I really liked that book when I was like in second grade, third grade.
Go ahead. Did you get cut off?
Oh, no, that's all I said. I just said the title and the author.
Say the title again really quick.
It's called The Tale of Despero by Kate DiCamillo. It's like a kid's book.
Okay. Why was that your favorite book? Or one of your interesting books?
I honestly don't remember. I just remember liking it a lot. It was about like this little mouse who was pretty weak, being like a hero at the end of the day, and I like that story.
Okay. Did you used to read it? Like this is the time when you read it, or somebody else was reading it to you?
I read it.
Okay. Okay. Somebody else. Anybody else have ideas on, or any thoughts on like your favorite book or favorite author? Or one of the books that you liked? How's that? So the Hunger Games books, okay? Jane Austen, okay. Why are they? Why did you like those books or that particular author? What was about them that you liked? Female hero descriptive story, very visual details. Very visual details. That's a very interesting way to put it. Okay, so Jane Austen is witty, okay? Okay. Now notice these books right here were just a bunch of words. There was no body language involved. And yet, they had such a big impact on the readers. The Hunger Games went on to become a movie franchise, and many other books, many other authors became famous for the way they wrote. Pride and Prejudice, or books that, for example, I believe they also made a book for the book called, a movie for the book called Little Women. I think it was one of the movies. But anyways, there's so many different books that have become movies because people enjoy it. And there's so many books that have not yet become movies, but people are still really fascinated by them. They're just really, really avid fans, or these like people that are like just like really passionate about these books. So all of that is just simple compilation of words. Words without body language. Why did they have such an impact, and how can our words, including text messages and emails, have tones to them that can inspire people and it can lead revolutions even, for example? How does that happen? What are we really doing when we're writing? How is the other person reading it? And how does Chomsky's how do his ideas come into play over here? The idea of universal grammar and many other things that he wrote about. Just in general, what's going on over here? Anybody know? Anybody have any thoughts on this? How can we use that as well for our advantage in a positive way? How are sensationalized fake news outlets or articles impacting the way people are actually doing things? What they end up thinking about? What kind of things they get involved in?
Well, like article titles and things, and especially because less and less people get their news from the news anymore, and more so from social media or whatever is already being said to them in their echo chambers of ideas and thoughts. Article titles have to be as short and effective and gripping as quickly as possible, which in turn means that writers and companies and publications, people are all having to write within that framework. So sometimes things are exaggerated, or just plain untrue, or can be perceived in multiple ways, or sound really extreme. But it has to be like really gripping.
Okay, so these are some ways that they're attracting people, right? Yeah. But how is language giving that much, like written language, adding so much tone to something? How can I elicit certain feelings and thoughts and energy, even in terms of motivation and drive and all these things, by just simply using certain words over others, certain phrasings over others?
I think if you use the right words and phrases that relate to someone more, it'll bring up their own emotions about other things that relate to what's being said.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
So you said description, Cynthia mentioned in the comments, description, detail, visual imagery, itinerary, literary devices, yes. So going back to Cynthia, when you were talking about words and how they can be perceived and so on, like text messages and breaking up on text messages, for example, what's happening there? Because if simple text messages can actually communicate tone and a bunch of other stuff, what's happening when those messages are received by a person or a person who's actually typing it and sending them?
Well, I think a text message is actual communication with the person, whereas reading a book is not actual communication with the person. It's you building a perception or essentially reacting to the information that you're reading, but it's not going to affect your life, if that makes sense, in the sense of like I'm saying that reading a book and talking to a person is two different things. And
why is it different? First of all, what is the definition of communication that you are using in this particular context? Because that definition might be different than mine or anybody else's in the audience. What's your definition of communication, and why? And what's your criteria to differentiate between the types of communications that are happening when an author is trying to communicate with the reader in a particular way, hoping for a particular impact and effect, whereas somebody else might be communicating a different way? So what is your definition of communication that would separate the two types, for example, and say, well, this one is not there for communication and this one is communication? Does that make sense?
that makes sense. So those are hard questions. I don't know if I want to answer them.
Because this is a thought experiment, I'm going to assume that everyone is actually experimenting mentally. And so you guys are really deep in thought. Keep thinking. These are good things to think about, because it impacts how we interact with other people, and it impacts how other people interact with us. Okay, so communication is conveying thoughts or ideas from noun A to noun B. Okay, so noun A to noun B. Notice this was in the context of goals. What if your goal was to communicate with another person, even if it was just that particular conversation you were having? How does that impact the situation now?
Can you repeat that question?
Yeah, notice. So Cynthia mentions in the comments about point A to point B, right? Trying to convey some information from point A to point B. Or noun A, person A, to noun B, person B. In this case, it could be person, it could be anything. Interacting with a computer, for example. Interacting with the computer means that you need to understand how the computer is going to take in what you're trying to do, and then you customize your approach accordingly. If you know that if I press the keyboard button that has the letter K on it, written on it, so for my reference, then it's going to show the K on the screen, right? Or if I understand that if I change that, so maybe it'll show some Arabic script instead, because that letter, that button is connected to something that's going to trigger a response in the computer, and it's going to understand it a certain way, translate it, and then show a different letter, right? So I'm interacting with a computer. If we're using nouns instead of person, noun A to noun B, then that is communication as well. In that case, a traffic light, for example, when it turns green, it's communicating with me. I have to understand that, and I have to customize my approach, meaning I stop if it's red, it's green, and go from there. Is that also interacting with, for example, animals, let's say your pets. For example, if you have a cat and you give it food, now you've sort of communicated something with it, a concept that it has understood, and that is that you are going to give it food. If you play with it, spend time with it, it gets bonded to you. So you've communicated something with it. You've communicated this idea, this concept of you having a bond with it, that you want to play with it, even if it's just in the concept of playing. So how do we use this goal setting approach also in our communication strategies? Going from point A to point B. Here you could say point here could be a noun, so noun A to noun B. How much power do you then have in terms of impacting the world around you, impacting yourself? If everything is about information sharing or communicating various, or conveying various thoughts or ideas between two nouns, those nouns could be anything. As I said, between a router and a computer, there's nothing different in that sense between conveying from cell phone to cell phone. Of course, there's obviously there's a lot of stuff in the middle, like the cell phone towers and all that stuff, right? But generally the same concept. So you're communicating with the device then communicates with whatever the cell tower is, the cell tower then communicates with other cell towers and stuff until it gets to the cell tower that's nearest to that person, and then that one goes down to the person's phone, and then they get the message, and then that message is communicated to you via the device. And there is a process in the middle to divert the message that was being communicated to the nearest cell phone tower, so that it doesn't just keep running around until it finds the person. It gets actually routed in a particular way because of certain strategies and decisions that really take place. How does AI or natural learning come into the picture here then? What's happening there? How is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala communicating with us then? In terms of our affairs and what happens, and we end up finding out because of, as we go in time, we realize certain things happen to us, or we realize that, when those things take place, we realize what was planned for us that we didn't yet know of the day before, the moment before, because we don't know what's in the future for us, right? How is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala communicating with us in terms of providing for us for certain things and stuff, the signs that He has put all around us and stuff that He tells us to look at and remember Him through, for example, that we usually just kind of pass by. We just walk by and we're just sort of not really focusing on them. If that is a definition of communication that we're using, that's okay, because if we're just defining it, we get to decide what definition we're using, then we also understand, what's implicit as a result of that definition. But if another person is using a different definition of communication, you can see where misunderstandings can take place. Well, you're not actually misunderstanding each other. It's just that you haven't really defined the same word in the same way. So if this is how it is, going from point B to point A, or point A to point B, then maybe we can use the same approach over here in terms of communication strategies. Notice over here we focus on point B before we focus on point A. If we don't understand the other person, or the other thing we're communicating with, whether it's a computer or a car, because that's also the same thing, because you're giving it commands and it's interpreting a certain way, right? And if we don't understand our current position, then maybe we're not going to be able to connect with each other as effectively. So why is it that we focus on understanding another person first, listening to them first, before we give them solutions? Step 2. Or step 3. Lots of things to think about. Any thoughts on this before we go ahead and close? My closing advice on this topic: don't ever stop thinking. Think, keep exploring, and keep learning, and keep adapting accordingly. Understand that the world is not defined by our individual experiences, but rather it's defined by how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala designed it, and that encompasses everything that's inside of it. So the world does not go according to us, but we must adapt, and we must understand how the world works so we can adapt accordingly. And when we don't do that, then we are impacted in a way that we don't like oftentimes. And this is in the context of the general topic of this series, this webinar series, on the idea of challenges and transformation. And there is a saying among the scholars about 3 stages of knowledge. And somebody else later on, some non-Muslim, also came up with this, or I don't know if they came up with it, maybe they came up with it or not. But anyways, there's this saying among the scholars, and that is that there are 3 stages of knowledge. The first one is you get a taste of it and you feel like you know everything. The second stage is you keep, as you're learning more and more, and you might find more doors are opening up and stuff. You open a door and you realize there were 15 doors behind it that you never knew even existed. And you thought you knew the world just with the first few doors and stuff, right? The second stage is when you start becoming humble, because you understand your position relative to everything around you. And then the third stage is when you realize you really know nothing. And that's not a negative feeling necessarily. It's just more of something to put in perspective, put ourselves in perspective, like put everything in perspective. And that's it. The first stage, you feel like you have it, you know everything. The second stage is you realize you really don't, and you become humble. And the third stage is when you realize you really know nothing at all. And that is the stage where you really understand, you kind of connect, and you kind of fall in place with everything around you. And that's the state where there are no more conflicts or concerns or frustrations and annoyances or any of those things, but rather you have harmony and contentment and tuma'nina. So think and keep thinking, and keep adapting and growing. Keep transforming until you become, and I don't want to sound like I am like, talking about something that's like kind of, maybe not Islamic, but what I'm going to say is until you become one with everything else, meaning you get back into position where you really are, like your actual position relative to everything else. That's what I mean. I don't mean by one with everything as if there's this thing where everything is one and you're a part of everything. You are everything and everything is you. And so I'm not talking about that, but I hope that made sense. Yeah. So she was mentioning in the comments about why she's quiet. Yeah, and take your time, because this is a very, very complex, and not just complex in a way it's difficult and you shouldn't go into it, but complex in the sense that sometimes we take it for granted that it's very easy to do these things and stuff, and that's it. But then we sort of disconnect from reality. The reality is there's so much more diversity and complexity to things than we try to give it, even if it's unintentionally. But we might do it just because we're trying to simplify things. And that helps us navigate things. If you were trying to figure out every detail about everything and stuff, right, you might become stagnant. So there's a practical implication of this. However, it does make it easier for us then to accept our shortcomings and accept, for example, our mistakes and own up to them and just keep growing and understand that we might not understand everything the way the other person intended, for example. And so there could have been misunderstanding and miscommunication, and that's okay because of the framework that we're talking about over here. So think about it, and think about how you can enhance your interaction with other people, how you can use what we discussed today in the best ways when it comes to your particular context. And these are among the best practices that I think might be relevant in this context, inshallah. I hope this was helpful. I hope this gives you something to think about. I hope this empowers you, bi'idhnillah, and helps you continue your transformation, inshallah. With that, inshallah, I'm going to go ahead and pause. I'm going to stop the recording. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت أستغفرك وأتوب إليك.